Somewhere behind the eyes of a broke, half-starved teenager working a graveyard shift at a convenience store, an ancient sword god was quietly counting the days until he could afford a house strong enough to survive an apocalypse. Nobody around him had any idea. To them, he was just another tired kid in a cheap uniform, scanning ramen packets at 2 in the morning. What they could not see was a mind that had commanded armies, split mountains, and buried an entire species of monster under a mountain of corpses on a world that no longer existed. That mind was awake now, wearing a borrowed face, and it was patient in a way no ordinary boy could ever be. To understand how a god ended up stocking shelves, the story has to go back to the night everything changed. Seo Dojan was 17 and dying. He lay curled on a filthy mattress in a one-room apartment that smelled of mildew and old grease. His stomach caved in from weeks of skipping meals so his little sister could eat. A fever had been building in him for days, the kind that came from working too many hours in the cold, with an empty stomach, and no one to notice he was sick. His grandmother sat beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead with hands that shook from age and worry. His sister, 7 years old, slept in the corner, unaware her brother's body was shutting down. Dojan did not think about himself in those final hours. He thought about unpaid loan shark interest that kept climbing no matter how much he scraped together. He thought about his grandmother's medicine, which he had stopped buying so the rent could get paid. Mostly he thought about his sister, Yoon, and what would happen to her once he was gone. He begged whatever was listening, God, spirit, or empty universe, to send someone who could protect her the way he never could. Something did answer. Across dimensions, in a place built from war and ruin, a soul was searching for a way out of its own ending. Carcelian Levandian had been the strongest swordsman his world ever produced. He had spent 300 years cutting down monsters that poured out of broken gates, watching kingdom after kingdom fall despite his blade, until only ash and silence remained where cities used to stand. In his final battle, gravely wounded and completely alone, he drove his sword through the heart of the last great beast, sealing a fracture in reality with the last of his strength. The cost of that seal was his own body. His soul, stripped of everything except memory and will, drifted through the space between worlds looking for anywhere to land. It found Dojan's fading spirit first. There, in the thin space between life and death, two very different souls met. One was a boy who had given everything for people he loved and had nothing left to give. The other was a warrior who had given everything for a world he could not save and had nowhere left to go. Dojan did not beg for revenge. He begged for his sister's safety. Carcelian, who had lost every person he ever protected, found something in that plain, exhausted wish that felt like an anchor. He made a promise to a dying stranger, one soul to another, that he would keep that boy's family safe for as long as he existed. Then the fever broke. The body did not. Dojan's spirit slipped away peacefully, finally allowed to rest, while Carcelian's consciousness settled into the boy's empty shell, like water filling a cracked cup. He opened his eyes to a strange white ceiling, cheap fluorescent light, and the small, terrified face of a 7-year-old girl gripping his hand. He tried to sit up and nearly threw up from how frail the body was. Where his old body could split boulders with a flick of the wrist, this one struggled to lift itself off a mattress. He checked his mana instinctively, the way he had checked it every day for 3 centuries, and found barely a flicker, a fraction, less than a fraction. He had gone from a being capable of leveling mountains to something closer to a sick house cat, and the sheer insult of it nearly made him laugh out loud in the middle of a dying boy's home. But a promise was a promise. Even at 10% strength, 10% of a sword god was still more than enough for this world to handle. He learned quickly. This was not his world. There was no war of extinction here, only scattered dimensional gates that leaked monsters if left unattended, and a government structure built around hunters ranked from lowly F all the way up to S. People here treated these gates like a business, a resource to be harvested for currency called magic stones. Compared to what Carcelian had survived, calling this place dangerous felt almost like an insult. His grandmother, an old woman named only Grandmother in his new memories, still believed he was her grandson recovering from a bad fever. His sister, Yoon, clung to him like she was afraid he would vanish again if she let go. He looked at both of them and felt something shift in his chest that he had not felt in longer than he could measure. Purpose. Not the grinding, hopeless purpose of survival in a dying world, but something smaller and warmer. A family to protect, finally within his reach. There was, of course, the matter of money. The original Dojan's memories came with all the ugliness attached. An illegitimate son born to a mistress, dumped on his father's doorstep after the man's real wife gave birth to a legitimate heir. A stepmother, Hong Hee-ju, who saw him as an embarrassment to be erased, rather than a child to be raised. She had thrown him and his sister out with nothing, keeping the family fortune for her own bloodline, and left him to drown in a predatory loan from a company called HCS Capital. 5 million won had somehow ballooned into 48 million through fees no honest lender would ever charge, and every month the number climbed higher while collectors grew more threatening. Carcelian absorbed all of it in a single breath of memory: the betrayal, the debt, the years of scraping by on odd jobs while his stepfamily lived in comfort. In his old life, cruelty like this would have earned someone a quick and final lesson. He saw no reason that standards should change just because he was wearing a different face. His first order of business was simple: get stronger and get paid. There was a gate not far from where he lived, a modest C-rank passage called the Namsan Gate, sealed off from civilians and monitored by a small control team. Ordinary hunters needed a license to enter. Carcelian had no license, no registration, and no patience for either. He waited until the guards at the checkpoint were distracted, slipped past a badly maintained fence, and walked in like a man clocking into work. Inside, the gate opened into a rocky ravine crawling with low-tier monsters, hunched gray creatures with too many joints, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. A group of licensed hunters somewhere deeper in the gate would have taken hours to clear this section, moving carefully, healing between fights, calling for backup if things went wrong. Carcelian cleared it in minutes. He did not draw a weapon at first. He simply walked forward, and every creature that lunged at him met a fist, an elbow, sometimes just a shoulder, and folded instantly, bones caving in ways that should have taken far more force than his weakened body should have been able to produce. Even at 1/10 strength, muscle memory from 300 years of war did not simply disappear. His body remembered how to move even when it could barely keep up with the memory. A control center agent monitoring the gate's internal cameras nearly dropped his coffee when unregistered movement lit up his screen. One small figure tearing through a section that normally required a 4-person B-rank team. He radioed for backup, assuming some kind of malfunction or an extremely reckless intruder about to get himself killed. By the time backup arrived, the intruder was already walking out with a sack full of magic stones slung over one shoulder, looking bored. Security tried to stop him at the exit. Carcelian looked at the 2 guards blocking his path, weighed the cost of explaining himself against the cost of simply leaving, and chose the second option. He did not hurt them. He barely touched them. A shift of his weight, a redirected grab, and both men found themselves sitting on the ground wondering how they got there, while a teenage boy in a worn jacket walked calmly past them into the daylight with enough magic stones to solve a very old problem. The stones sold for more than he expected. Even low-grade material from a C-rank gate, sold in bulk to a broker who clearly did not ask enough questions, brought in a stack of cash that would have taken the original Dojan months of part-time work to earn. He handed most of it to his grandmother that same evening, watching her stare at the money like it might disappear if she blinked too hard. Yunyong noticed the change immediately. Her brother, who used to come home hollow-eyed and exhausted, now moved like someone who had actually rested, deeply, after years of never quite managing it. She did not understand why, only that something in him felt different, steadier, like a building with a foundation poured overnight where there used to be nothing but cracked concrete. She hugged him tighter than usual that night and asked if they could get chicken. He said yes before she even finished the question. Debt collectors from HCS Capital came the following week, right on schedule, expecting another round of empty promises and stalling. 2 men in cheap suits knocked on the apartment door, already halfway through their usual threats before Dojan even opened it fully. They demanded payment, reminded him of the interest that never stopped growing, and warned him what would happen to his family if the debt stayed unpaid. Carcelian let them finish talking. He found something almost nostalgic about petty men trying to intimidate someone they assumed was helpless. Then he stepped outside, closed the door behind him so his sister would not see, and asked them very calmly to walk him to wherever their boss counted his money. They laughed at first. The taller one grabbed his collar, more out of habit than actual concern, the kind of move that had worked 100 times on 100 frightened tenants. His hand never got a chance to close properly. Dojan's fingers wrapped around the man's wrist, and pressure that should have been impossible from a scrawny teenager sent the collector to his knees with a sound like a branch snapping underfoot. The second man reached for something in his jacket, maybe a weapon, maybe just his phone. He did not get the chance to find out which one mattered, because a short, precise strike to the ribs put him on the ground gasping for air that would not come easily for several minutes. Neither man tried to fight back after that. They simply agreed, through gritted teeth and genuine fear, to take him wherever he wanted to go. The debt would not stay at 48 million won for much longer. Neither would the people who thought a scared, broke teenager was an easy target. The two collectors led him to a squat office building on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place with tinted windows and a lobby that smelled like stale cigarettes. HCS Capital occupied the top 2 floors, guarded by men who looked more comfortable holding bats than calculators. Dojan walked in behind his 2 limping escorts, hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like a kid who had wandered in by mistake. The guards at the door sized him up and dismissed him instantly. That was their first mistake. Their second was reaching for him at all. He moved through the lobby the way water moves through a crack, finding the gaps between bodies before the bodies even registered he was there. A guard swinging a bat, connected with nothing but air, overbalanced, and found the floor rushing up to meet his face. Another grabbed for a radio and discovered his own arm no longer wanted to cooperate. Twisted at an angle joints were never meant to bend. Within a minute, 6 grown men who made their living scaring frightened debtors were groaning on the tile, and a scrawny teenager had not so much as wrinkled his jacket. Huang Changsup, the man who ran the entire loan shark operation, heard the commotion from his office upstairs and assumed some rival gang had come to make a statement. He came down expecting a negotiation, flanked by 2 more bodyguards, a cheap gold watch flashing on his wrist as he adjusted his tie. What he found instead was his entire ground floor security team lying in various states of pain, and a teenage boy sitting casually on the edge of a reception desk, flipping through a folder of loan documents like he owned the place. Huang recognized the name on the folder before he recognized the face. Seo Dojan, the nobody who was supposed to be too broken and too poor to ever cause trouble. Dojan looked up, closed the folder and asked, in a voice far too calm for the situation, whether Huang wanted to discuss the interest rate his company had been charging a dying family, or whether he preferred to discuss it with his hand still attached. Huang laughed. It was the kind of laugh men use when they are more afraid than they want to admit. He gestured for his remaining bodyguards to handle the problem, confident that whatever had happened downstairs was a fluke, bad luck, nothing that 2 more men with more experience could not fix. It was not a fluke. The 2 bodyguards closed in from either side, the kind of pincer move that worked against ordinary opponents who could only watch one threat at a time. Carcelian had fought battles where 100 monsters converged on him at once from every direction imaginable. 2 men with brass knuckles barely registered as a threat worth acknowledging. He sidestepped the first strike, redirected the man's own momentum into a support pillar hard enough to crack the drywall, and caught the second man's incoming punch in an open palm, holding it there like he was catching a slow-moving ball rather than blocking a full swing. The bodyguard's face went white as he realized his fist simply was not moving anymore, no matter how much force he threw behind it. Huang finally understood that laughing had been a mistake. He tried to back toward his office, tried to call for more men, but Dojan was already across the room before he finished turning around. There was no shouting, no dramatic buildup, just a hand closing around Huang's collar and a calm, almost friendly smile that did not match the situation at all. Dojan told him, in the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather, that he understood interest rates existed for a reason. He explained that greed was fine, business was fine, but preying on a family with a sick grandmother and a dying boy crossed a line that deserved a permanent lesson rather than a temporary one. Then he shook Huang's hand. It started warm, almost polite, the kind of handshake that closes a business deal. Then heat began to build, faint at first, like holding a mug of tea that had sat too long, then rapidly climbing past anything a normal hand should ever produce. Huang's confused expression twisted into panic and then into raw, animal pain as steam curled up from between their fingers. He screamed, tried to pull away, found he could not, and watched in horror as his own hand separated cleanly from his wrist under heat that should not have been physically possible from human flesh alone. The sound that came out of him did not resemble words at all. It was closer to an alarm going off in a body that had never expected to feel real pain. Dojan released him, let him collapse to the floor clutching the ruined stump, and crouched down to his eye level with the same pleasant, terrifying calm. He informed Huang that the family debt was now closed in full, effective immediately, and that going forward, HCS Capital would be providing free security services to his grandmother and sister whenever needed, as a show of good faith. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he expected no further contact from collectors, lawyers, or anyone else associated with the company, ever again. Huang agreed to every single word before Dojan even finished the sentence. News of what happened at HCS Capital did not travel through official channels. It moved the way fear always moves in the underworld, quietly, through whispered warnings between men who suddenly found new respect for a name they used to laugh at. Within days, the loan shark network across 3 districts knew better than to so much as glance in the direction of Seo Dojan's family. At home, none of this reached his grandmother or sister directly. What they noticed instead was smaller, quieter things. Collectors stopped calling. The constant tension that used to hang in the apartment like humidity before a storm simply lifted. His grandmother slept through the night without waking once, something she could not recall managing in years. Yunyong stopped flinching every time someone knocked on the door. Dojan used some of the money from the gate stones to finally take his sister out properly, something he had not managed to do in years. He walked her through a department store she used to only look at through the window glass, let her pick out clothes without checking a single price tag, and bought her a stuffed rabbit nearly as big as she was, which she immediately named and refused to put down for the rest of the day. They ate at a real restaurant afterward, the kind with tablecloths and a waiter who did not sigh when a customer asked for a second refill of water. It was in the middle of that outing, laughing at something small his sister said about the rabbit needing its own seat at the table, that he saw them. His stepmother, Hong Heju, dressed in clothes that cost more than his family used to make in half a year, walking beside her own daughter through the same store, both of them glancing over with expressions that curdled instantly from confusion into contempt. Hong Heju's first thought was that the beggar boy had stolen something. Her second thought, arriving a beat too late, was that something about the calm, unbothered way he met her eyes did not match the frightened, broken child she remembered discarding. She had no idea yet how badly that assumption was about to cost her. Hong Heju approached first, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, her daughter trailing a step behind with the same practiced sneer their family wore like a uniform. She looked Dojan up and down, taking in the new clothes on his sister and the shopping bags stacked by their table, and something like offense flashed across her face, as if his sudden comfort was a personal insult directed at her. She asked, voice dripping with false sweetness loud enough for nearby tables to hear, where a discarded street rat like him managed to find money for a place like this. She wondered aloud if he had finally resorted to something illegal, the way trash from his side of the family always eventually did. Yunyang's small hand tightened around her brother's sleeve, the old fear creeping back into her shoulders. Dojan felt that fear like a physical weight, and something inside him, something patient and ancient and entirely unbothered by loud women in expensive coats, decided this was as good a moment as any to start correcting the record. He did not raise his voice. He told her plainly that the money came from honest work, which was more than could be said for a woman who built her entire fortune on throwing a dying man's children out into the street. He reminded her, calmly, that a mistress's son inheriting nothing was normal enough, but that hiring people to make sure he never lived long enough to complain about it crossed into territory the police tended to find interesting. Hong Heju's face went rigid. Her daughter's smirk froze halfway through forming. She had assumed, wrongly, that whatever happened at that gate years ago had ended quietly, buried the same way everything inconvenient in her life got buried, with money and silence. She had no way of knowing that the boy sitting across the restaurant now held every detail of that night in his memory, with perfect, cold clarity, filed away for exactly the right moment. Dojan did not press the matter further, not yet. He only told her, in a tone far too pleasant for what he was actually saying, that she should enjoy whatever peace she still had left, because it would not be lasting much longer. Then he turned back to his sister, asked her if she wanted dessert, and let the topic drop entirely, as though the woman standing rigid beside their table had already stopped mattering. Hong Heju left without another word, her daughter hurrying after her, both of them glancing back once with expressions that had shifted from contempt into plain unease. That night, walking home with his sister asleep against his shoulder on the bus and his grandmother waiting up for them with tea already brewing, Carcelian allowed himself a small, private moment of satisfaction. In his old life, victories had come soaked in blood and grief, entire wars fought just to buy a single season of peace. Here, in this strange, smaller world, a single handshake had settled a debt, a single sentence had cracked open a woman's confidence, and a single afternoon had given his sister a memory worth keeping. It was not much yet, but it was a beginning, and Carcelian Levandian, once the last sword left standing at the end of a dying world, intended to build something out of this beginning that no one, not corrupt heroes, not scheming stepmothers, not the thin, stingy manna of this planet itself, would ever be able to tear down again. He still had a debt of his own to settle, one that had nothing to do with money. A promise made in the space between two dying souls, whispered in the dark before the fever broke. Every gate he cleared, every corrupt hand he humbled, every one he earned brought him one step closer to keeping it in full. Somewhere across the city, in a control office monitoring the Namsen Gate, an agent quietly filed a report about an unlicensed intruder who had cleared an entire C-rank section without a scratch, a report that would eventually land on the desk of people far more dangerous than loan sharks and bitter stepmothers. The Hero Association did not yet know the name Seo Dojan. That, too, was about to change. Word of the HCS Capitol incident and the confrontation with his stepmother never made it into any newspaper, but it changed something quieter and more important inside Dojan's own house. His grandmother, quietly, stopped asking careful questions about where the money came from. She simply trusted her grandson, watched him grow calmer and steadier by the week, and let herself believe things were finally turning around. They were, though not in any way she could have guessed. With the debt gone and his stepfamily rattled, Carcelian turned his attention towards something more useful than petty extortionists. Low-grade stones from a C-rank gate had solved an emergency. They would not build the kind of life he had promised a dying boy. For that, he needed real strength, real income, and a foothold inside the world's actual hunting economy instead of skulking around its edges. That meant a bigger gate. It also meant dealing with people who ran the business of gates for a living, starting with the appraisers who decided how much a stone was worth. He picked his target carefully. Night Island Gate sat off the southern coast, rated B rank, considered dangerous enough that most guilds sent full 5-person teams and still lost people inside it. Officially, it required a license, an approved team, and government clearance. Unofficially, an old smuggler's route along the coastline let a patient man slip past the checkpoint with nothing but a rusted lantern and a bad attitude. Carcelian was patient. He had 300 years of practice at exactly that. The gate opened onto a sea cave laced with bioluminescent fungus, pale blue light crawling up jagged stone walls like veins under skin. Water dripped somewhere unseen, echoing through tunnels that branched in every direction. Most hunting parties spent days mapping this place before they dared go deeper. Dojan walked the main tunnel like he already knew where it led, ignoring 3 separate side passages that a cautious team would have scouted first. He carried a sword this time, an old, chipped blade he had bought secondhand from a pawn shop for less than the price of a decent dinner. It had a crack running halfway up the metal and a grip that had seen better decades. Compared to the weapons he once carried in his old world, weapons forged from monster bone and folded 1,000 times, this thing was barely a sharpened stick. It would have to do. The first real threat came from the dark ahead, a scuttling mass of segmented limbs and clicking mandibles the size of a delivery van. Local hunters called them coast crawlers, mid-tier monsters strong enough to shred through steel plating if given the chance. This one sensed him from 30 feet away and charged without hesitation, 6 legs driving it forward faster than something that size had any right to move. Dojan did not retreat. He stepped into the charge instead, ducked under a snapping claw the size of his torso, and drove the cracked blade straight through a gap in the creature's underside, where the shell grew thin. The sword bit deep, black blood spraying across the cave floor, and the crawler's momentum carried it another 10 feet before its legs finally buckled and it collapsed in a twitching heap. The old blade had held, barely. A thin new crack ran further up the metal now, threatening to give out entirely on the next real fight. Carcelian glanced at it, unimpressed, and kept walking. 3 more crawlers fell the same way over the next hour, along with a pair of eyeless cave hounds that hunted by sound and never even registered his approach until teeth met flesh they could not stop. Each kill cost the sword another fracture, another sliver of metal peeling away, until the blade looked less like a weapon and more like something salvaged from a scrapyard fire. Deeper in, The tunnels opened into a massive underground cavern, lit by veins of glowing mineral running through the ceiling like frozen lightning. At the center of that cavern coiled something far larger than anything he had faced so far, a serpent easily 40 feet long, scales the color of wet asphalt, twin rows of fangs dripping with a viscous black substance that hissed faintly where it touched stone, the Black Killing Viper. Local records listed it as the reason Night Island Gate carried its B-rank designation in the first place, a boss monster that had already claimed 2 separate hunting parties who underestimated it. It noticed him immediately, rising up on coils thick as tree trunks, head swaying with the slow, deliberate menace of something that had never once lost a fight worth remembering. Its first strike came fast, quicker than a creature that size should have managed, jaws snapping shut on empty air where Dojan had been standing a half-second earlier. He answered with a strike of his own, driving the failing blade into the softer scales along its neck. The sword held for exactly one more hit before the crack finally won, the old metal shearing clean in half with a sound like a gunshot, leaving him holding a jagged stub of a hilt against a wounded, furious apex predator 3 times the length of a bus. A lesser fighter would have panicked. Carcelian simply adjusted. He had spent 3 centuries learning that a weapon was a tool, not a crutch, and that true strength lived in the body wielding it rather than the metal itself. He dropped the broken hilt, closed the distance the Viper did not expect him to close, and drove his bare fist into the wound the sword had already opened. Bone cracked under the impact. The Viper shrieked, a sound that shook loose dust from the cavern ceiling, and thrashed hard enough to send small stalactites crashing down around them. It lunged again, mouth wide enough to swallow a grown man whole, venom dripping in thick ropes from fangs longer than his forearm. Dojan caught the lower jaw with both hands, muscles in his borrowed body screaming under strain it was never designed to handle, and held the bite closed through sheer stubborn will, while heat built in his palms exactly the way it had for Huang Changseop days earlier. The Viper's jaw did not survive the heat. Neither did much of what came after. By the time the fight ended, the cavern floor was slick with black blood, and the massive serpent lay motionless across broken stalagmites. Its skull caved inward from a final blow that Carcelian delivered with nothing but his forearm, and whatever leftover strength his body had scraped together. He stood over the corpse breathing hard, arms trembling from actual exertion, muscles pushed further than this world had yet demanded of him, and felt something close to genuine satisfaction at finally meeting an opponent worth the effort. The gate stabilized shortly after, its boss monster dead, its rift energy settling into the quiet hum of a properly cleared passage. Behind him, deeper tunnels held smaller side chambers packed with magic stones the Viper had been hoarding for years, high-grade material worth considerably more than anything he had pulled from Namsen Gate. He gathered every stone he could carry, wrapped them in cloth from his torn jacket, and walked back out through the same smuggler's route he had used to get in, leaving no trace behind except a dead Viper that the Hero Association would eventually stumble onto and spend weeks trying to explain. Selling stones from an unlicensed B-rank clear posed its own problem. Legitimate brokers asked questions unlicensed hunters could not safely answer. Carcelian solved that problem the way he solved most problems now, by finding the weakest link in the chain and applying pressure until it gave. The appraiser he chose ran a small shop tucked between a noodle stand and a pawnbroker in the Hunter district, a nervous, sweaty man named Do, who had built a reputation for asking few questions in exchange for steep commission fees. Do's usual rate ran close to 20%, an outrageous number he justified by claiming the risk of handling unregistered material. Dojan walked in carrying a bag heavy enough that Do's eyes lit up the moment he heard the stones clink together. The appraiser's excitement faded fast once he actually examined the material. High-grade crystals, the kind that should have come from a licensed A-rank team, not from a scrawny teenager in a torn jacket. He asked, carefully, where exactly these stones had come from, already calculating how much extra he could squeeze out of someone clearly operating outside the law. Dojan told him the truth, that he had cleared Night Island Gate alone and killed its boss monster with his bare hands, and watched Do's nervous laugh die somewhere in his throat when the man realized the story fit the ruined, half-feral state of his visitor's clothes far too well to be a lie. Do tried his usual routine anyway, quoting a commission rate that would have swallowed nearly a fifth of the sale's value, citing risk and discretion and market volatility in the same breath a used car salesman might use to justify a bad deal. Carcelian let him finish the entire pitch before responding. He reached across the counter, not violently, just resting 2 fingers against the edge of Doe's scale, and asked whether 1% sounded like a fairer number, given how much risk he personally was prepared to introduce into the appraiser's evening if the answer came back wrong. Heat did not need to build this time. Doe's imagination filled in the rest on its own, aided considerably by rumors already spreading through the district about a loan shark boss missing a hand and a teenage boy who apparently walked through B-rank monsters like they were foot traffic. 1%, Doe agreed immediately, voice cracking slightly on the second word. He would even throw in expedited processing, no questions asked, discretion guaranteed. The sale cleared within the hour, converting a cavern full of dead vipers' hoarded treasure into a sum of money that dwarfed anything the loan shark debt had ever demanded. Dojan left the shop with enough capital to seriously consider what came next. Not just surviving, not just clearing debts, but actually building something permanent for the family he had promised to protect. Strength, though, still lagged behind ambition. A cracked pawnshop sword shattering against one boss monster made that painfully clear. Over the following week, between short trips into low-rank gates to keep cash flowing, Carcelian pushed the borrowed body harder than any modern trainer would have dared recommend. He ran until his lungs burned, lifted scavenged scrap metal until his arms shook, and practiced old sword forms with nothing but a wooden stick, because a real blade capable of surviving those forms did not exist yet in his price range. Progress came slowly, the way it always does for a body built on modern human limits, rather than 3 centuries of monster hunting. Still, day by day, the borrowed muscle began remembering what the mind already knew. A punch that once wobbled with poor form started landing clean. Footwork that stumbled on uneven ground grew sure. He was nowhere close to his old strength, but the gap was narrowing, one bruised knuckle at a time. Meanwhile, the anomaly report from Night Island Gate did not stay buried in a filing cabinet for long. It crossed the desk of a junior analyst who happened to mention it during a break room conversation, half joking about ghost hunters clearing gates for free. That comment reached the ears of a guild assistant working under one of Korea's rising S-rank heroes, a man named Kang Yong-pyo, already well known within hunter circles for climbing the ranks through connections as much as raw talent, and for a temper that made subordinates choose their words carefully. Kang Yong-pyo did not care much for an anonymous stone thief costing brokers a sliver of commission. What caught his attention was the boss monster itself, a B-rank threat that 2 full teams had already failed to clear safely, apparently taken down by a single unlicensed intruder without so much as a registered kill claim. Men like Yong-pyo built entire careers on collecting rare monster materials and taking credit for dangerous clears. The idea that someone was doing his kind of work for free, quietly, without wanting recognition, irritated him in a way he could not immediately explain. He filed the report away in his own memory rather than the official system, the way a man files away a splinter he intends to deal with eventually. For now, more pressing matters occupied his schedule: corrupt deals to manage, favors to collect, a cousin named Kang Chol-woo who kept causing minor headaches with his own reckless debts. An unlicensed nobody clearing B-rank gates barely registered as a priority. That would change eventually. For now, Yong-pyo's name existed only as a rumor Dojan had never heard, and a shadow he had not yet learned to watch for. His grandmother noticed the new bruise along his jaw before he managed to hide it, her sharp eyes catching what a careless glance would have missed. She asked, gently but firmly, whether the work he had taken up was dangerous. He told her, half true, that he had picked up shifts at a gym doing sparring for extra pay, and that the bruises looked worse than they felt. She did not fully believe him. Grandmothers rarely do. But she also recognized something steadier in the way he carried himself now, a calm that had not been there before, and decided that whatever he was doing, it seemed to be working. She made him sit while she pressed a cold compress to his jaw anyway, muttering that even gym work should come with more care taken. Yunyong had her own concerns, voiced later that night while she sat cross-legged on his bed refusing to go to sleep. She told him she had overheard kids at school talking about hunters who never came home from gates, heroes with families who waited by the television for news that never came. She asked him, in the small, direct way only a child can manage, whether he was going to be one of those people someday. Carcelian felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with physical injury. In his old life, he had made peace with death 100 times over, had watched comrades fall, and simply kept moving because the war demanded it. This was different. This was a 7-year-old girl who had already buried enough people in her short life and deserved, more than anything, the certainty that her brother would not become one more name on that list. He told her, as steadily as he could manage, that he did not plan on going anywhere. He reminded her that he had already survived things most people would not believe if he told them, and that he intended to keep surviving for a very long time, long enough to watch her grow up and get annoyed at him for embarrassing her in front of her friends. She studied his face for a long moment, the particular scrutiny only children seem capable of, searching for whatever it is that tells a kid when an adult is lying. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she finally curled up against his side and let herself drift off, one hand still fisted in the sleeve of his jacket, like she needed proof he was staying put. He sat there long after her breathing evened out, turning that hidden fear over in his mind, another piece of information he had absorbed from the original Dojan's memories, a wound that ran deeper than empty stomachs or eviction notices ever had. Every rift he closed from here forward carried a little more weight than simple survival. It carried a promise made twice now, once to a dying stranger in the space between worlds, and once again to a wide-eyed girl who was too young to understand exactly what she was trusting him with. Back at home, life took on a rhythm that felt almost dangerously close to normal. Grocery bills stopped causing quiet panic. His grandmother's next round of medicine got purchased without hesitation, a proper prescription instead of the cheaper, less effective substitute she used to settle for. Yunyong started bringing home better grades, freed from the exhaustion of helping stretch a household budget that no longer needed stretching. Small comforts piled up quickly once real money entered the picture. A working refrigerator that did not need a folded napkin wedged under one leg. New shoes for Yunyong that actually fit instead of ones handed down 2 sizes too big. A space heater that meant winter nights no longer meant sleeping in every layer of clothing they owned. None of it was extravagant by the standards of families who had never known real hardship, but each small upgrade landed like a small miracle to people who had spent years bracing for the next disaster instead. Carcelian watched his grandmother hum quietly to herself while cooking dinner one evening, a habit the original Dojan's memories confirmed she had abandoned years ago when worry crowded out every smaller joy. He watched his sister fall asleep on the couch mid-sentence, safe and warm and no longer flinching at every sound from the hallway outside. Small victories, the kind that meant nothing to a world used to measuring heroism in monster kills and headline rescues, and meant absolutely everything to the only family he had left in any world. There was still an obligation he owed that no amount of currency would ever settle, a vow spoken quietly in the space where 2 lives had crossed. Nothing measured that debt except the safety of the people it was made for, and nothing paid it down except results. It was on an ordinary evening, sitting on the balcony with a cup of cheap instant coffee while Yunyong did homework at the kitchen table behind him, that Carcelian first felt it. A pressure against the back of his skull, faint as a held breath. The kind of sensation only someone who had spent centuries near broken dimensional boundaries would recognize at all. Modern hunters called it rift sense, a rare instinct that let a trained few feel a passage forming before any sensor caught it. Most licensed heroes trained for years to develop even a weak version of it. Carcelian had never needed to train for it. He had lived inside collapsing boundaries so long that his body simply remembered the warning signs the way anyone remembers the smell of smoke. He set the coffee down and looked up, past the tangle of power lines and the neighbor's drying laundry, toward a patch of sky that looked exactly like every other patch of sky to untrained eyes. To him, it shimmered faintly, a ripple in the air no wider than a doorway, the kind of distortion that meant a rift had already begun forming, even if it would take weeks or months to tear open completely. He knew the rules of this world well enough by now, learned from the original Dojan's scattered memories and confirmed by every gate he had personally walked through. A rift, unlike a controlled gate, was uncontrolled and unpredictable, growing on its own timeline rather than one the government could schedule inspections around. Left unaddressed past a certain threshold, usually somewhere between 10 and 29 days depending on its size, a rift did not simply stay open. It broke, spilling every monster inside it out into whatever unlucky neighborhood happened to sit beneath it, an event hunters called a monster wave and civilians called the worst night of their lives. This particular distortion sat almost directly above their building. Carcelian did not panic. Panic had never solved anything in 300 years of war, and it would not start solving things now. He simply filed the information away, calculating rough timelines in his head, the way he once calculated troop movements against an advancing horde. Whatever this became, he intended to be more than ready for it, long before the government's slow, bureaucratic detection systems even noticed it existed. He glanced back through the sliding door at his sister, tongue poking out in concentration as she worked through a math problem, utterly unaware that somewhere above her homework and her half-eaten snack, the sky itself had quietly started counting down. He felt no fear for himself. He felt something closer to grim anticipation, the particular readiness of a man who had spent an entire lifetime meeting exactly this kind of threat and had never once lost when it truly mattered. Whatever came through that rift when it finally opened, it would find something modern Earth had never actually faced before. Not a helpless family cowering behind a locked door, but a sword god standing directly between them and anything foolish enough to try. That night, before sleep took her, his grandmother mentioned offhand that the building superintendent had posted a notice about strange readings near the roof. Some maintenance crew sent to check the water tanks for a leak that never turned up. She laughed it off as typical bureaucratic nonsense, the kind of notice nobody in the building ever bothered reading past the first line. Carcelian said nothing to correct her. There was no version of the truth that would not have frightened her more than the silence already did, and frightening her served no purpose he could see. He would handle it himself, the way he had handled everything else since waking up in this borrowed body, quietly, thoroughly, without waiting for anyone else's permission to act. Somewhere above Mapo District, invisible to anyone without a hunter's trained eye, a thin distortion had begun forming in the sky, a fracture too faint yet for government sensors to flag as a genuine threat. It sat directly above the modest apartment building where his family slept, patient and silent, waiting for the day it would tear open completely. Carcelian did not know it yet, but the next gate would not need to be found. It was already coming to him, and this time, it would not open somewhere safely distant. It would open directly over everyone he had promised to protect. 9 days after Carcelian first felt that pressure behind his skull, the sky above their building finally gave up pretending to be ordinary. It happened just after midnight, a sound like distant thunder rolling sideways instead of down, followed by a flash of violet light that turned every window on the block into a mirror for half a second. Car alarms went off in a chain reaction down the street. A dog 3 floors below started barking and did not stop. Carcelian was already on his feet before the light finished fading, moving to the balcony while his grandmother stirred awake in the next room, and Yunyong sat up in bed rubbing her eyes, more confused than afraid. Above the rooftops, where nothing had existed an hour earlier, a jagged tear now hung suspended in the air, edges glowing faint violet, pulsing slow and steady like something breathing. It was smaller than most rifts shown on emergency broadcasts, barely the size of a delivery truck, but its position left no room for comfort. It hovered directly over their building, close enough that a stray gust of wind seemed to bend visibly around its edges. Government sirens started within minutes, distant at first, then closer, the kind of automated alert system that triggered whenever a rift crossed a certain size threshold near residential zones. Neighbors spilled into the street in pajamas and hastily thrown on coats, phones raised, voices climbing toward panic. A rift this close to an apartment complex meant evacuation orders were coming, and evacuation orders meant hours, maybe days, of displacement, while an assigned hunting team assessed and cleared it on the association's own timeline. Carcelian had no intention of waiting for anyone else's timeline. He told his grandmother to stay inside with the door locked, keep Yunyong calm, and trust that whatever happened next, it would be handled. She grabbed his sleeve, real fear plain on her face, and asked where exactly he thought he was going. He told her the truth, that he intended to go up and deal with it directly, and watched her expression shift from fear into something closer to disbelief, the kind reserved for a person who had clearly lost their mind. Yunyong, still half asleep, asked if he was going to fight the hole in the sky. He told her yes, and that it would probably take him a little while, and that she should not worry no matter what she heard from outside. She studied him with the same searching look she always used when checking whether he was lying, found nothing there but calm certainty, and simply nodded, small and solemn, before letting her grandmother pull her back from the window. He left through the fire escape rather than the street, avoiding the crowd of evacuating neighbors and the first arriving government vehicles, and climbed toward the rift the same way he had climbed toward every fight in 300 years of war, directly, without hesitation, and without waiting for permission from anyone who might try to stop him. The rift's edge felt like stepping through a curtain of cold static, every hair on his borrowed body standing on end for the half-second it took to pass through. Then the world on the other side snapped into focus, and Carcelian found himself standing somewhere that made his chest tighten with a recognition he had not expected. It was a forest, or what remained of one, ancient trees rising into a sky the color of a healing bruise, purple and orange bleeding together at a horizon that did not quite match how horizons were supposed to behave. The air here carried a density he had not felt since his own world burned to ash. Mana so thick it pressed against his skin like humidity before a storm. At the center of the clearing, towering over everything else in the strange, dying landscape, stood a tree, unlike anything modern Earth had ever produced. Its trunk alone stretched wider than a city block, bark the color of old silver, roots disappearing into ground that pulsed faintly with each slow beat, as though the entire forest shared one single heartbeat. Carcelian knew this tree. He had seen its twin once before, in the deepest reaches of his own dying world, standing at the exact center of a battlefield where he lost more comrades than he cared to remember. A world tree, one of the ancient anchors that stabilized mana flow across an entire realm, the kind of relic most scholars in his old life assumed existed only in myth by the time civilization collapsed. Finding one here, bleeding through a rift no larger than a delivery truck, explained everything about why this particular passage refused to behave like every other gate he had cleared so far. He approached slowly, senses alert for the monsters that typically guarded rifts this deep, but the clearing stayed eerily quiet except for a low, resonant hum coming from the tree itself, a sound that seemed to vibrate directly through bone rather than air. Whatever creatures once called this dying forest home had either fled or fallen long before he arrived. Placing a hand against the ancient bark, Carcelian felt something he had not experienced since the night his old world ended. Power, raw and abundant, flowing directly into him the moment skin touched wood. Mana denser and purer than anything modern Earth's thin atmosphere could ever hope to produce. This tree was dying, he realized almost immediately, its once vast reserves drained down to a final trickle by whatever catastrophe had torn its home realm apart before spilling the fragment through into this rift. But even dying, even reduced to embers of its former self, it held more raw mana than every gate he had cleared since arriving in this borrowed body combined. A plan began forming, simple and immediately obvious to a mind that had spent 3 centuries solving exactly this kind of problem. He could not carry a world tree home. He could, however, absorb what remained of its power directly, the same way he once channeled ambient mana from dying battlefields during the darkest years of his old war. He sat down at the base of the tree, cross-legged, one palm pressed flat against the silver bark, and opened himself fully to whatever the ancient relic still had left to give. The first surge nearly tore him apart. Modern human anatomy, even one hardened by weeks of brutal training, was never designed to channel power on this scale. Pain lanced through every nerve as mana flooded in faster than his body could process it. Muscles seizing, vision whitewashing at the edges, a pressure building behind his eyes that felt like his skull might simply give way under the strain. Carcelian gritted his teeth and held the connection anyway. He had survived worse pain in his old life more times than he could count, had continued fighting through wounds that should have killed him outright, and a body adjusting to sudden power was a small price, compared to battlefields soaked in the blood of everyone he failed to save. Pain, in the end, was simply information. It did not get to make his decisions for him. Hour by hour, his body began adapting, the way it always eventually did. Muscle fibers that once strained under modern human limits began reknitting themselves at the cellular level. Mana channels long dormant since his arrival slowly widening to accommodate flow they had not carried in weeks. What began as agony gradually settled into something closer to a controlled burn, painful but survivable, productive rather than simply destructive. Outside the rift, government hunters arrived at the boundary within the hour. A full assessment team dispatched the moment sensors flagged unusual energy readings, far beyond what a rift this size should have produced. They found the passage stable, its edges no longer expanding, its internal pressure holding steady rather than climbing toward collapse, a pattern none of their instruments had ever recorded before. Standard procedure called for immediate entry to investigate. Standard procedure also assumed whatever waited inside posed a threat requiring a full combat team rather than caution. The assessment lead, a cautious veteran named Officer Beck, made the call to hold position and monitor rather than send people in blind. a decision that would later earn him quiet praise for restraint. Nobody at the time realized was actually saving his team from an encounter they were nowhere near equipped to survive. Days passed inside the rift, the way they always seemed to inside spaces touched by ancient magic, time bending subtly out of alignment with the world outside. What felt like a single long, painful session of absorption to Carcelian stretched across nearly a month by the calendar his family experienced on the other side of the tier. His grandmother did not sleep properly for the first week. She kept his portion of every dinner covered on the stove, told herself it was silly, and did it again the next night anyway. Yunyong asked, every single morning, whether her brother had come back yet, and every single morning received the same gentle, uncertain answer that no, not yet, but soon. Neighbors whispered theories about the strange, oddly stable rift hovering over their building, about the boy who had reportedly gone missing the same night it appeared, about hunters posted at a careful distance who seemed content to simply watch and wait rather than act. Some assumed the worst. Others assumed nothing at all, distracted by their own smaller daily crises. Only 2 people in that entire building understood that somewhere on the other side of that violet tier, something extraordinary was quietly reshaping itself into something the world had never quite seen before. Inside the dying forest, Carcelian's body kept absorbing what the world tree had left to offer, day bleeding into day with no clear marker beyond his own gradually strengthening pulse. Around the 10th day, he could stand without the tremors that had plagued him since arriving. By the 15th, muscle density that once belonged to a starving teenager had reshaped itself into something leaner and considerably more dangerous, still nowhere close to his old peak, but climbing steadily toward it in a way that felt less like recovery and more like genuine restoration. He explored the dying forest during breaks in the absorption, careful never to stray too far from the tree's fading pulse. He found the skeletal remains of creatures that must have once called this realm home. Bones scattered among roots the size of small buildings, evidence of a war that had clearly ended in total defeat long before this fragment ever tore loose and drifted into modern Earth's version of reality. He found, too, small clusters of what modern hunters called eternal embers, tiny motes of fire mana clinging stubbornly to life around scorched patches of bark, remnants of whatever final catastrophe had scarred this realm before its end. He gathered every ember he could carry, storing them carefully in cloth wrapped tight enough to survive the trip home, sensing correctly that fire mana this concentrated would prove useful for far more than simple warmth. By the 25th day, the tree's pulse had slowed to something barely perceptible, its final reserves nearly spent entirely into the body sitting patiently at its base. Carcelian felt something that might have been grief pass through him as the ancient relic's presence dimmed further with each passing hour. A strange kinship formed between a dying god of nature and a warrior who understood better than most what it meant to give everything you had left for something that mattered. On the 29th day, the world tree finally went silent. Its trunk did not crumble dramatically or explode in some final burst of energy, the way lesser stories might imagine. It simply stopped, the low resonant hum fading into ordinary silence, roots settling motionless into ground that no longer pulsed with any rhythm at all. Whatever it had been, whatever realm it once anchored, it had given the last of itself freely, and Carcelian felt the weight of that gift settle into his bones, alongside the raw power it left behind. He stood slowly, testing muscles that finally felt something close to familiar again. Not his old strength, not yet, not fully, but close enough that the gap between what he currently was and what he used to be had narrowed to something measured in mere degrees, rather than the vast, humiliating chasm he woke up to a month earlier. The rift around him had grown unstable in the tree's absence, its internal structure no longer anchored by anything strong enough to hold reality's fabric steady. Carcelian recognized the signs immediately, having watched countless similar spaces collapse during his old war. Without intervention, this rift would tear itself apart within hours. And a rift collapsing internally rather than sealing properly meant exactly one outcome for anyone standing beneath it when it finally broke. He gathered every last ember, every remaining stone scattered through the dying forest, and turned his attention toward the tier itself, the thin, fraying boundary between this dying realm and the world where his family slept unaware just beyond it. Sealing a rift from the inside required a very specific kind of power, the sort modern Earth's hunters had never developed a technique for, because none of them possessed mana dense enough to attempt it safely. Carcelian, freshly restored to something approaching his former strength, possessed exactly that. He pressed both palms against the fraying edge of reality, channeled every drop of newly absorbed mana into a single sustained push, and forced the boundary closed the same way he had once sealed the fracture that cost him his original body centuries ago. The tear resisted at first, straining against the pressure like something alive and desperate to stay open, before finally, gradually, folding shut in one final, breathless collapse. Outside, the assessment team watching from a careful distance saw the impossible rift simply vanish, its violet glow collapsing inward and disappearing entirely, leaving nothing behind but ordinary open sky and a stunned silence among hunters who had genuinely expected to spend the next several years monitoring an anomaly nobody understood. Carcelian stepped back into the world exactly where he had left it, standing once again on his own building's rooftop, breathing air that tasted like home in a way he had not expected to feel this strongly. Below him, sirens still wailed faintly in the distance, evacuation notices still fluttered from lampposts nobody had bothered removing yet, and somewhere inside that building, two people who loved him had spent nearly a month believing they might never see him again. He climbed down through the fire escape, moving with a fluid strength his body had not possessed in weeks, and let himself quietly back into the apartment. His grandmother was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea long gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, the way people do when exhaustion and worry finally overwhelm the ability to do anything productive with either. She looked up when the door creaked, and for one long, suspended second, neither of them moved at all. Then she was on her feet, moving faster than her aging body had any right to manage, both arms wrapping around him with a grip that trembled from relief rather than weakness. She did not ask where he had been. She did not demand explanations he could not safely give her. She simply held on, tears soaking into his shoulder, murmuring his name softly, again, confirming to herself that this was real, and not some cruel trick of exhausted grief. Yunyang woke to the sound of her grandmother's crying and came stumbling out of her room, rubbing sleep from her eyes, confusion turning instantly to disbelief and then to something close to joy violent enough to knock the breath out of her. She crossed the room at a dead sprint and threw herself against him hard enough to stagger a grown man, sobbing into his side without any of the careful composure she usually tried to maintain in front of adults. Carcelian knelt down, wrapped both arms around his sister, and held her while she cried out nearly a month's worth of fear all at once. He said nothing for a long while, letting the moment simply exist without trying to explain or minimize it, understanding instinctively that some wounds needed to be felt fully before they could begin healing properly. When she finally quieted, hiccuping and exhausted, she asked him if the hole in the sky was gone for good. He told her yes, that it was closed permanently, and that nothing like it would ever threaten their home again, as long as he had any say in the matter. She believed him completely, the way only a child still young enough to trust absolutely can believe something so large. Carcelian intended to make certain that belief remained justified for as long as he existed in this world, whatever it eventually cost him to guarantee it. Morning brought questions he could not fully answer. Neighbors wanted to know where the missing boy from the third floor had been hiding for nearly a month while hunters camped outside their building. A local news crew, drawn by a rift that had vanished as suddenly as it appeared, knocked on doors looking for anyone who might explain what happened. Carcelian kept his story simple, telling anyone who asked that he had been staying with distant relatives out of town and knew nothing about any rift, a lie thin enough that a careful investigator could have poked holes in it within minutes. Fortunately for him, nobody investigated that carefully. Rifts collapsing on their own without explanation happened rarely enough to be strange, but not rarely enough to warrant a full inquiry when no casualties resulted and no property damage needed compensating. Officer Beck filed his report noting an unexplained stabilization event, recommended further monitoring of the location as a precaution, and moved on to the dozen other anomalies competing for his department's limited attention. Carcelian used the confusion to his advantage, slipping back into ordinary life before anyone thought to look at him too closely. His grandmother noticed the changes in him almost immediately once the relief of his return settled into something calmer. He stood straighter now, moved with an ease that had not been there even during his best weeks of training, and carried himself like someone who had shed an old, heavy weight he never fully admitted to carrying. She asked him, gently, what exactly happened wherever he had gone. He told her only that he had found a way to get stronger, strong enough that she and Yunyang would never need to worry about safety again, and left the rest deliberately vague. She studied him for a long moment, the same searching look Yun had inherited from her, and decided, as grandmothers eventually learned to do, that some mysteries were better left unexamined so long as the person carrying them clearly meant well. She simply nodded, patted his cheek the way she had when he was small enough to fit in her lap, and told him dinner would be ready soon. Yun, for her part, stuck close to his side for days afterward, refusing to let him out of sight even for short errands, a clinginess he understood completely and never once complained about. Slowly, day by day, her fear eased back into ordinary childhood confidence, though she kept, for months afterward, a habit of checking the sky whenever she stepped outside, just to make sure nothing violet and jagged had appeared without warning. Karselian spent the following weeks quietly assessing exactly how much his month inside that dying forest had changed him. His strength, while still short of what it once was, had climbed dramatically closer to his old peak. His mana reserves, thin and fragile since arriving in this borrowed body, now held steady at levels that would have qualified him for serious consideration among this world's strongest licensed heroes, had anyone known to test him properly. The eternal embers he carried home pulsed faintly with warmth even wrapped in cloth, waiting patiently for a purpose he had already begun planning. He thought often, in quiet moments, about the promise that had brought him here in the first place, a dying boy's simple wish for his family's safety, and about how far that promise had already carried him from the frightened, starving teenager who first opened his eyes in a hospital bed. A locked apartment door and a distant hope that hunters arrived in time no longer felt like an acceptable definition of safety, not when he had personally watched what happened to entire kingdoms that trusted walls too thin to matter. He began imagining something sturdier. Not just an apartment with better locks, not even a nicer house in a quieter neighborhood, but something built from the ground up to withstand exactly the kind of catastrophe this world still refused to take seriously enough. A home no rift, no monster wave, no corrupt hero with a grudge could ever threaten. It would take considerable wealth to build something like that properly, wealth well beyond what low and mid-rank gates could ever provide. Fortunately, he now possessed something considerably more valuable than gate stones scavenged from B-rank passages. Buried among the roots of a dying world tree, in a realm few humans would ever glimpse and fewer still would survive walking through, he had gathered high-grade hero magic crystals unlike anything modern Earth's markets had ever processed in bulk. Selling even a fraction of them properly, through channels legitimate enough to avoid unwanted scrutiny, promised more capital than most guild leaders accumulated across entire careers. That would require navigating parts of this world's hunting economy he had so far avoided entirely. Licensed appraisers who actually reported large transactions, government registries that tracked serious wealth with considerably more attention than they gave small-time loan sharks or petty stonebrokers. It would mean, eventually, stepping fully into the light rather than working quietly from its edges. Karselian found he did not mind the idea nearly as much as he once might have expected. A sword god had spent 3 centuries hiding his true strength from nothing, because in his old world, everyone already knew exactly what he was capable of. Here, in this strange, smaller world that still measured danger in convenient ranks and neat categories, stepping into the light on his own terms felt less like exposure and more like finally beginning to build something that could not be taken away again. Somewhere across the city, unaware that the quiet nobody from Night Island Gate had just walked out of a collapsed rift carrying enough wealth to reshape his family's entire future, the Hero Association continued compiling scattered reports about an unregistered civilian who kept solving problems their licensed heroes were paid handsomely to handle. Sooner or later, someone with real authority would connect those scattered dots. When that day came, Karselian intended to be more than ready for whatever attention followed. Selling nearly 60 billion won worth of hero magic crystals could not happen through a nervous shop owner squeezed between a noodle stand and a pawnbroker. This required real infrastructure, licensed exchanges built to move wealth on a scale most citizens never encountered in their entire lives. Karselian chose the Korea Central Hunter Exchange, a gleaming tower downtown that handled transactions for the country's top guilds, and walked in wearing clothes nice enough not to draw immediate suspicion, but plain enough that nobody mistook him for old money. He carried a sealed case of crystals that made the receiving clerk's professional composure crack the instant she opened it under proper lighting. Word moved up the chain fast. Within the hour, a senior appraiser named Director O personally handled the transaction himself, running each crystal through spectral analysis with hands that visibly shook the first time results came back. High-grade material, purity readings that matched samples usually pulled only from the deepest S-rank rifts, in quantities that made no sense coming from an unregistered teenager with no guild affiliation and no combat license on file. Director O asked, as diplomatically as decades in the business allowed, exactly where these crystals had originated. Dojan told him a version of the truth that left out anything about dying alternate realms or ancient world trees, simply stating that he had cleared a previously unknown rift and recovered the material personally. The claim was thin enough to raise eyebrows and thick enough to survive scrutiny, especially once Director O realized that pressing too hard on a client capable of producing this much wealth in one sitting was terrible business practice regardless of how the story sounded. The final number, after taxes, exchange fees, and a modest bribe to keep the transaction quiet from press attention, settled at just over 67 billion won. Dojan walked out of that tower holding a bank confirmation that would have seemed like fiction to the boy who used to skip meals so his sister could eat. He did not celebrate. He simply began making calls, the first to a real estate consultant with a reputation for discretion, the second to a private tutor who could help Yun-Young catch up properly on schoolwork missed during difficult years, the third to a specialist clinic that could finally give his grandmother the kind of care her aging body actually needed, rather than whatever a stretched budget once allowed. Money, once scarce enough to cost him sleep, had become simply a tool now, one more resource to deploy carefully in service of the only promise that actually mattered. There remained, however, one piece of unfinished business that money alone could not settle. Kang Chol-woo, the corrupt hunter who had once lured the original Dojan into a gate specifically to die there, still walked free, still drew a paycheck as a licensed B-rank hunter, still answered to no one for a crime buried years earlier under Hong Heeju's money and silence. Carcelian found him easily enough. A quiet dinner at an upscale restaurant that Chol-woo apparently favored for celebrating recent promotions with colleagues who had no idea what kind of man they were drinking with. Dojan walked in alone, requested a table near enough to overhear the conversation, and waited with the same patience he had spent 3 centuries perfecting. Chol-woo noticed him eventually, recognition dawning slow and then all at once, the color draining from his face as he realized the ghost from his worst memory had just sat down 20 feet away, wearing an expensive jacket and an expression of complete calm. He excused himself from his colleagues, approached Dojan's table with forced casualness that fooled nobody, and asked, voice tight, what exactly he wanted. Dojan gestured to the empty seat across from him and suggested they discuss old business properly, somewhere private enough that Chol-woo's dinner companions would not overhear anything uncomfortable. Chol-woo, calculating his options and finding none of them favorable, sat. What followed was not a negotiation. Carcelian had already recorded everything on a small device tucked into his sleeve, and he made certain Chol-woo understood exactly how thoroughly cornered he already was before extracting a single word. He reminded the man, calmly, of a specific gate, a specific date, and a specific arrangement made with a woman named Hong Heeju to ensure a particular teenager never walked out alive. Chol-woo tried denial first, weak and unconvincing even to his own ears. Dojan let him finish, then simply asked whether he preferred to confess on his own terms now, quietly, or have the truth extracted through methods considerably less comfortable than conversation. The confession came quickly after that, every detail spilling out in a shaking, defeated voice while the recording device captured every incriminating word. Hong Heeju's involvement, the payment structure, the specific instructions to make the death look like an accident inside a poorly monitored gate section. Chol-woo, once he started talking, seemed almost relieved to finally set the weight down. Carcelian thanked him for his cooperation with the same pleasant, terrifying calm he had once used on a loan shark boss, then reached across the table and broke both of the man's hands with 2 precise motions, too fast for anyone nearby to properly register as violence rather than an accident. Chol-woo's scream drew brief attention from other diners before Dojan's expression, cold and utterly without remorse, convinced them collectively that this was not a situation worth investigating personally. Desperate and half out of his mind with pain, Chol-woo lunged for a steak knife left on the table and swung wildly with whatever grip his ruined hand could still manage. Carcelian caught the blade between 2 fingers, twisted it free, and used the same motion to drag the edge once across the man's face. close enough to cost him sight in one eye without touching anything vital. A crude, permanent reminder, the kind that would follow Chol-woo into every mirror for the rest of his life. He left Chol-woo crumpled against the table, informed him quietly that his career as a hunter had just ended permanently, given hands that would never properly hold a weapon again, and walked out with the recorded confession secured safely for whatever use it eventually served. Justice, Carcelian reflected on the walk home, rarely looked clean in his old world either. It simply needed to land where it belonged. With that piece of unfinished business settled, and considerable capital now sitting quietly in accounts his stepfamily could never trace, Carcelian turned his attention toward legitimizing his position within this world's hunting hierarchy properly. Continuing to operate entirely outside the system invited exactly the kind of scrutiny he had so far managed to avoid through luck and careful timing, rather than genuine safety. An opportunity arrived sooner than expected, through a guild recruitment notice posted at the Central Hunter Exchange seeking additional support for a joint rift expedition. The listing came from Kleom Guild, one of the country's most respected mid-tier organizations, currently preparing to clear a B-rank rift alongside a visiting S-rank hero known for personally vetting every team she worked with. Dojan applied under a temporary contractor registration, the kind of loose affiliation that let unlicensed civilians with proven combat aptitude join supervised expeditions without full guild membership. His application, backed by nothing but a demonstration fight against 3 low-tier monsters supplied by the guild for testing purposes, ended in under 4 seconds, each creature dispatched with a single controlled strike that left the observing guild staff exchanging stunned glances. The S-rank hero overseeing candidate selection watched that entire demonstration from a shadowed observation deck without announcing her presence, arms crossed, studying the unregistered applicant with an intensity that had nothing to do with routine evaluation. Her name was Hun Juin, Korea's 4th-ranked S-rank hero, known across the hunting world for both her considerable combat record and a reputation for near-impossible standards when it came to trusting new talent. She had rejected qualified applicants from established guilds without hesitation on gut instinct alone. She had never, in 5 years of running these evaluations personally, seen anyone move the way the boy on the training floor had just moved. She approached him directly once the demonstration ended, ignoring the guild administrator already moving to deliver rejection paperwork out of pure institutional caution regarding unregistered civilians. She introduced herself simply, watched his expression for any hint of recognition or nervousness that most people showed when meeting someone of her rank, and found neither. Dojan met her gaze evenly, offered a polite greeting that carried none of the awe she usually encountered from prospective recruits, and waited to hear what she actually wanted, rather than performing the deference she had grown tired of expecting. Julian found that refreshing, in a way she did not immediately examine too closely. She informed him that she would personally vouch for his participation in the upcoming expedition, regulations regarding unlicensed civilians be damned, and warned him plainly that she expected him to keep pace with an S-rank clearing operation rather than simply follow orders from the back of the formation. Dojan told her that keeping pace would not be a problem. Something in the flat, unbothered certainty of that answer made Julian's estimation of this strange applicant climb another notch higher than she usually allowed for someone with 0 official combat history. She had built an entire career on reading people accurately within seconds of meeting them. Everything about this particular read suggested she had just stumbled onto something the rest of the hunting world had not yet noticed existed. Neither of them spoke of it directly, but something had shifted the moment their eyes met across that training floor. A mutual curiosity neither one felt any immediate need to name. The expedition would depart within the week. Carcelian intended to make certain that once Korea's 4th-ranked S-rank hero watched him work inside a live gate, she would understand exactly how badly she had underestimated what she just recruited. The rift assigned to Kleom Guild that week opened into a scorched volcanic basin, black rock cracked by veins of glowing orange heat, sulfur thick enough in the air that most of the 10-person team wore filtration masks within minutes of entering. Julian led from the front, calm and methodical, issuing formation calls with the practiced ease of someone who had commanded far larger operations than this modest B-rank clear. Dojan walked near the rear of the formation as instructed, technically the lowest ranked and least trusted member present, exactly where an unregistered contractor belonged, according to every rule Julian herself had insisted on enforcing. That arrangement lasted less than 20 minutes. A cockatrice, a vicious hybrid monster part serpent and part fowl, burst from behind a cracked boulder formation and drove straight toward the formation's flank, wings beating hard enough to kick up scalding ash in every direction. Standard doctrine called for a coordinated response, ranged support pinning the creature's movement, while melee fighters closed carefully from multiple angles to avoid its petrifying gaze. Dojan disregarded every part of that doctrine. He broke formation before anyone could call him back, closed the distance in 3 strides that should have been physically impossible across loose volcanic rock, and leapt directly into the cockatrice's path rather than around it. The creature's head snapped toward him, eyes beginning to glow with the paralytic effect that had turned 3 separate hunting teams to stone over the years this particular breed had terrorized rift zones across the country. Carcelian's fist connected before the gaze ever fully activated. The punch caught the cockatrice square between its eyes and drove clean through bone, momentum carrying the creature's entire skull downward into the volcanic rock with enough force to crack the ground itself. He did not stop there. A second strike, his boot coming down with deliberate, almost bored precision, finished what the first blow started, reducing what should have been a dangerous threat into a flattened, unrecognizable mess in less time than it took the rest of the team to fully register what had just happened. Silence followed, broken only by the distant hiss of volcanic vents and the ragged breathing of a support archer who had frozen mid-draw, arrow still knocked, mouth hanging open. Julian stared at the scene for a long moment, weighing the reckless breach of protocol against the sheer, absurd efficiency of what she had just witnessed. A cockatrice that should have required a coordinated 5-person response had just died to 2 unarmed strikes from a teenager technically ranked below every actual hunter present. She did not reprimand him, not yet. She simply filed the moment away alongside every other piece of evidence, stacking up that this particular recruit was not what his paperwork claimed him to be. Deeper into the basin, the true purpose of this expedition waited. Local surveys had flagged unusual seismic activity near the rift's core, activity the Guild's initial scouting report attributed to shifting volcanic strata, but which Julian, with a veteran's instinct for danger, suspected meant something considerably worse had made its home inside this rift. She was right. The creature that emerged from a cavern mouth deeper in the basin stood easily 20 meters tall, a draconic horror wrapped in obsidian black scales, wings folded like broken umbrellas against a spine ridged with bone spurs sharp enough to gut a truck. Caesarion, the report would later name it, a boss monster, responsible for the deaths of dozens of A and S rank hunters across 3 separate failed clearing attempts in neighboring countries, before this rift apparently offered it fresh territory to claim. The entire team froze. Even Julian, with a combat record most guild leaders envied, felt her pulse spike at the sight of something this far beyond anything a standard B-rank clearing operation was ever meant to encounter. She called for immediate withdrawal, voice tight but steady, already calculating evacuation routes and emergency beacon protocols for a threat this far above their pay grade. Dojan did not withdraw. He stepped forward instead, alone, closing the distance between the team and a monster that had already ended the careers of hunters considerably more experienced than anyone currently watching in stunned, horrified silence. Julian shouted a warning that died halfway out of her throat as Caesarion's attention shifted fully onto the lone figure approaching it without visible fear or hesitation. The dragon struck first, a massive clawed hand sweeping down with enough force to level a small building. Carcelian met it head-on, catching the strike between both palms, boots grinding twin furrows through solid volcanic rock as he absorbed momentum that should have pulverized every bone in his body. The impact alone sent a shockwave rippling outward, strong enough to knock 3 team members off their feet. He held. Then, in a single fluid motion that seemed to defy the sheer physics of what a human body should be capable of producing, he redirected the dragon's own strength back into its extended arm, wrenching the massive limb sideways with a crack of shattering bone that echoed across the entire basin. Caesarion roared, a sound that shook loose ash from every surrounding rock formation, and lunged with its remaining good claw and a mouthful of teeth the size of kitchen knives. Carcelian ducked under the bite, drove upward with a palm strike that connected squarely beneath the creature's jaw, and felt something give way beneath the force of it. What followed lasted less than 10 seconds by the time anyone present managed to review it afterward on recorded footage. Carcelian closed the remaining distance, planted both feet, and drove a single devastating punch directly into the center of the beast's chest, past scales that had turned aside heavy artillery fire in previous encounters, straight through to whatever vital structure kept a creature this size alive. Kassarian's massive body swayed once, twice, and then collapsed sideways with an impact that registered on seismographs 3 towns away. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. Team members who had just watched a boss monster capable of ending entire hunting parties die to a single unarmed strike stood frozen, several visibly shaking, one support healer sitting down hard on the volcanic rock without seeming to notice she had done it. Julian approached slowly, stepping past the massive corpse toward the young man who had just casually dismantled a threat that should have required an entire nation's emergency response protocol to handle safely. She studied his face, searching for adrenaline, for exhaustion, for any of the physical tells that should have accompanied a fight of that magnitude. She found him breathing normally, expression calm, already glancing toward the cavern mouth Kassarian had emerged from to check whether anything else waited inside worth addressing before they left. Whatever careful professional distance Julian had maintained throughout years of vetting new talent cracked, just slightly, in that quiet moment. She had spent her entire career searching for genuine strength hiding behind exaggerated reputations, and had grown cynical enough to assume most claims of hidden power amounted to nothing once tested properly under real pressure. This was not exaggeration. This was something else entirely, something she did not yet have a category for, and something she found herself unwilling to simply file away and forget once the expedition ended. The team returned to the surface in a state somewhere between celebration and shock. Guild administrators scrambling to process reports of a Kassarian-class kill nobody had authorization codes prepared for. Julian handled the official paperwork herself, quietly adjusting the language around exactly who delivered the killing blow, buying Dojan a measure of privacy from the media circus that would have otherwise descended on an unregistered civilian capable of soloing an apex threat. She found him afterward, sitting alone on a supply crate near the extraction point, while the rest of the team celebrated with the kind of loud, relieved energy people only produce after surviving something they genuinely believed might kill them. He looked, if anything, mildly bored, watching the celebration with the detached patience of someone who had witnessed considerably larger victories mean considerably less in the grand scheme of things. Julian sat down across from him without asking permission, studying his profile for a long moment before speaking. She asked him directly, no diplomatic hedging, exactly who he actually was, because whoever wrote his contractor application clearly knew nothing real about the man sitting in front of her. Dojan considered the question longer than she expected, weighing how much truth this particular stranger had earned. He settled on a version close enough to honest without inviting questions he could not safely answer. He told her he had survived things most people would refuse to believe, that his strength came from somewhere he could not fully explain yet, and that his only real goal here was protecting the family he had left, quietly, without unwanted attention complicating that already difficult task. Julian studied him for a long beat, weighing the answer against every professional instinct that told her something did not add up cleanly. Instead of pressing further, she surprised herself by deciding it did not matter yet. Whatever he was hiding, it had not stopped him from throwing himself between a monster and her team without a second's hesitation, and in her experience, character revealed itself faster in a crisis than any amount of paperwork ever could. She offered him something practical instead of more questions, her personal guarantee towards securing an official S-rank license, cutting through years of bureaucratic evaluation most hunters spent grinding through case by case. A man capable of soloing a Kassarian-class threat had no business operating in legal gray areas indefinitely, both for his own protection and, she admitted with a faint, reluctant smile, for the considerable convenience of having him properly registered as someone she could call on again. Dojan accepted, mostly because an S-rank license solved several practical problems at once: easier property acquisition, cleaner financial transactions, fewer awkward questions from officials who might otherwise wonder why an unregistered teenager kept clearing threats above his supposed pay grade. Something quieter passed between them as the arrangement settled, unspoken, and not yet fully acknowledged by either side. Julian, who had spent years building walls high enough to keep casual admirers and career opportunists equally at bay, found herself oddly reluctant to end the conversation once official business concluded. Dojan, who had buried an entire lifetime of losses under centuries of hardened discipline, found something unexpectedly steadying in a woman who judged him purely on demonstrated action rather than rumor or reputation. Neither said anything more meaningful than a professional goodbye before parting ways that evening. Both walked away thinking about the conversation considerably longer than either would have admitted out loud. Behind them, unnoticed by either, a guild administrator quietly filed away video footage of the Kassarian kill for internal archives, footage that would eventually find its way, through channels neither Dojan nor Julian anticipated, into the hands of people far less interested in his well-being than a curious S-rank hero happened to be. Somewhere across the city, a woman named Hong Hee-ju sat in her lawyer's office, listening to a prosecutor friend of the family outline exactly how a fabricated charge might finally put her troublesome stepson somewhere he could no longer humiliate her in public. The recording Chol Woo had given up, the crippled loan shark empire, the collapsing web of lies she had spent years maintaining, all of it demanded a response considerably more aggressive than anything she had attempted so far. None of them realized the boy she intended to bury under corrupt paperwork had just walked away from a fight that would have killed every prosecutor in that entire building combined. The fabricated charge arrived 3 days later, delivered by 2 officers at Dojan's door with a warrant citing assault allegations tied to an anonymous complaint about the Chol Woo incident, conveniently stripped of any context regarding a decade-old murder conspiracy. Prosecutor Park Chow-young, a longtime family friend Hong Hee-ju had cultivated for exactly this purpose, moved with unusual speed to secure detention before bail hearings could even be scheduled properly. Dojan went without resistance, calculating correctly that fighting uniformed officers over a corrupt legal maneuver would only hand his stepmother a cleaner narrative to work with. He sat in a holding cell overnight, unbothered, running through exactly how long this particular game deserved to be humored before he ended it permanently. He never got the chance to end it himself. Julian ended it for him. Word of his detention reached her within hours, funneled through a guild administrator who mentioned it in passing without realizing the name meant anything to her. She arrived at the prosecutor's office the following morning wearing her official rank insignia, a detail she rarely bothered displaying, and requested Prosecutor Park's file on the case with a directness that left junior staff scrambling. What she found took less than 20 minutes to unravel. Park's paperwork listed no verified witness, no corroborating evidence beyond a single unsigned complaint, and a suspiciously accelerated timeline that skipped procedural steps no legitimate prosecution ever bypassed without raising red flags. A quick call to a contact inside Internal Affairs confirmed what Julian already suspected. Park's financial records showed a substantial deposit from an account traced back to Hong Hee-ju's holding company, timed within days of the charge being filed. Julian confronted Park directly, laid the evidence across his desk without preamble, and informed him plainly that an S-rank hero's formal complaint regarding prosecutorial misconduct carried considerably more institutional weight than whatever favor he thought he was doing for an old family friend. Park's composure cracked within minutes. He withdrew the charge himself before noon, citing insufficient evidence, and quietly resigned from his position within the week rather than face a formal misconduct review. Dojan walked out of holding that afternoon with probation attached to the Chol Woo assault, a technicality Julian negotiated down from what could have been considerably worse given the injuries involved, and a clear record on every charge Hong Hee-ju had actually intended to use against him. His stepmother, watching her legal maneuver collapse in less than a day thanks to a hero she never anticipated getting personally involved, finally understood just how thoroughly the boy she once discarded had outgrown every advantage she thought she still held over him. Karselian walked home that evening beside Julian, neither one quite acknowledging out loud how naturally the arrangement of her simply showing up to protect him had settled into place. He thanked her properly for the intervention, and she waved it off with the same brisk professionalism she used to deflect most gratitude, though something in her expression suggested the gesture mattered to her more than she let on. He still had the house to build, a stepmother's remaining schemes to dismantle, and a debt owed to a dying boy's family that no amount of billions or broken hands could ever fully repay, only honor a little more completely, with every threat removed from their lives. The next chapter of that promise was already forming somewhere across the ocean, in a country still learning to survive its own gates, where something darker than any monster he had faced so far waited to test exactly how far a sword god's strength could actually stretch.